On the 4th of June 2024, we were introduced to Star Wars history. For the first time, we were presented with a visual media that was not connected with the Star Wars cinematic timeline. It was a show set in the High Republic era, with the events taking place 100 years before the Phantom Menace. It had endless possibilities. No established timelines to connect to, no nostalgia bait needed to be hooked on a pole to entice the audience, just a blank page for new heroes and villains chapters to be written upon. And for the fans, a new era of Star Wars media that upon its success could open the door to Disney branching out the Star Wars content tree. The Dawn of the Jedi, the Old Republic, the High Republic could all lay in wait to grace our screens and expand the Star Wars cinematic timeline beyond the stars. All of this and more awaited us as we bared witness to the launch of The Acolyte.
I think it is the worst thing I have literally ever seen.
I can see why nobody likes this show.
Acolyte is being destroyed because it genuinely f***ing sucks.
Huh. Well, that took a turn. So how did The Acolyte go from a beacon of hope for the timeline expansion in Star Wars content to reintroducing a division in the fanbase not seen since 2017? Well, let's have a look at the different elements that led to The Acolyte becoming the worst reviewed Star Wars show of all time. So let's start from the beginning. The Acolyte was announced in May 2020 with further details of the premise and title provided in December that year, and it was during this period that Disney was introducing the Star Wars television universe, and we would have Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka, Andor, 3 seasons of The Mandalorian and The Bad Batch, and season 2.5 of The Mandalorian before the first trailer for The Acolyte even dropped. And after a solid start with the masterclasses in The Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2 and Andor, the reception to new Star Wars shows was on a downward trend. And with The Acolyte having to follow the 2023's offering of a lackluster 3rd season of The Mandalorian and the Ahsoka / season 5 of Rebels / hey look, it's Anakin show, expectations were at an all-time low. So, was The Acolyte damned before it even had a chance? I mean, we know how the reception of The Last Jedi had a hand in the failures of the Solo movie, and given the seemingly dwindling quality of the shows over the years, was The Acolyte just a victim of Star Wars fatigue, the excuse that Kathleen Kennedy likes to use in lieu of providing engaging content? No. The premiere of The Acolyte had 4.8 million viewers, which was the highest for a premiere of any show on Disney Plus in 2024, clearly showing that any preconceived notion of Star Wars fatigue wasn't the issue. But perhaps another preconceived notion about the show would be its eventual downfall.
Put a chick in it, make her gay!
The controversy surrounding this tag stemmed from an interview with The Wrap, in which the interviewer stated that this is the gayest Star Wars ever by a considerable margin, to which showrunner Leslie Headland replies, "People have told me it's the gayest Star Wars ever, and frankly, I'm into it." She also adds that C-3PO is gay, and it is canon that R2-D2 is a lesbian. Now, the term woke has evolved beyond a term of political injustice and discrimination to also include social representation in modern media, and it has become more important for creators to provide representation to different social groups in their work, and Star Wars is no different. Despite the representation of strong female leads, black characters, and apparently homosexual droids from its inception, Star Wars has long been a target for social groups for the lack of representation, especially within the LGBTQ community. Now, Star Wars has always been about inclusion because that's how George Lucas wrote it. All the alien races you see living and working together in a galaxy far, far away, it's about showing how everyone is equal. But because George didn't shout aloud that this character is gay or this character is disabled, Star Wars isn't inclusive. And because this vocal minority prioritize a clear message of representation, we've seen how Disney have allowed the storytelling in their Star Wars products to be impacted in meeting that expectation. Take the sequels for example. Rey was presented as a strong female lead who became more powerful across the trilogy, whereas her male co-lead went from coward to hero in the first movie before becoming Rey's bag carrier by the third. It was also within this trilogy we were reintroduced to the original three, and we see how Leia Organa continued her distinguished role as a strong leader of the Resistance, whereas her male co-stars, well, they were just relegated to just being a down-on-his-luck scoundrel again, and an angry, cow-tit-sucking fallen Jedi master.
Look how they massacred my boy.
And this is why sections of the fanbase revolt against perceived woke products, because they've seen how Disney have butchered their heroes to prioritise representation over the telling of a compelling story. Now, there's no doubt there will be outright bigots who judge the show based solely off its seeming wokeness, but it is also okay for viewers to be frustrated when the social message overhauls the narrative, especially as it's possible for representation to be part of a show's natural flow. Take Andor, and how Vel and Cinta's relationship played an important role in Vel's character arc without disrupting the tone of the show. Or how Skeleton Crew's KB arc about her fears of losing her best friend because her disability impacts the way she used to do things before her accident just naturally flowed with what we were presented throughout the story. And this is where the Acolyte may be a victim of woke culture, because I do believe that these fan scores are not a fair representation of the audience's experience with the show, because I struggle to believe that there is this big of a gap in the audience score between these two shows based solely off the viewing experience. Though that being said, the viewing experience was not great.
Like a panther.
Now, since this video is about looking at all the different elements that led to the Acolyte's downfall, this won't be the most comprehensive breakdown of its story because, well, there's already a lot of videos covering that. But here's my take on the Acolyte experience. So the initial premise of the show actually had me excited in the lead up to its release. A Jedi murder mystery at the time when the Jedi were at their most powerful? Sign me up! But a few episodes in, you realise it's not about that. It's a show about a good and bad twin. Or actually, it's a show about the cover-up of a Jedi crime. Or, no, wait, it's a show about a lesbian witch cult teaching Plagueis how to manipulate the midichlorians. No. Honestly, by the end of this show, I had no idea what the premise was meant to be about. It felt like Leslie and her writing team were following Trey Parker and Matt Stone's 6 Days to Air model for South Park, except with nowhere near the quality level. There were times where characters would go from point A to point B and even back to point A with no explanation. Take May for example. Her initial mission is to gain revenge on the Jedi that killed her family, and even after finding out her sister's still alive, this is still her mission at the start of episode 4. But by the end of the episode, she decides, sod this, my sister's alive, so I'm gonna hand myself in to the Jedi. But then has a change of heart immediately when she is being arrested by a Jedi. She then manages to reunite with her sister, and instead of explaining that she's gaining revenge for their mother's death, decides that gaslighting her sister into believing she was brainwashed by the Jedi is the way to go. And when this direction somehow doesn't work, May attacks her sister, leaves her for dead, and goes back to where she started the episode before by hunting the Jedi. And it's this crisscrossing and lack of exposition that affects a lot of this show, making it difficult to establish what this show is actually about. And then there's the Sarlacc pit-sized plot holes and nonsensical decision making. Jesus Christ. Take the Jedi and Witches of Brendok arc, which took up 2 flashback episodes in an 8-episode series to tell us that the great crime of the Jedi that the whole story is based upon was the killing of a Force-using witch who turns into a cloud monster to try and envelop a child. And they try and make the audience feel bad for Mother Anastasia by having her say that she was going to let Osha join the Jedi. A fact that she could have informed Saul about 5 minutes prior, but instead decides to show him nothing but hostility. But this was the great Jedi crime? Now you could have easily wrote an arc that made the Jedi look more culpable in this. Maybe had them attempt to take the girls more forcefully considering they are a virgins in the Force, the first evidence of biological life created by the Force itself. That's something that the Jedi would want to study and understand, so presenting them as attempting to use their self-imposed galactic authority to take the children would have given this arc a more contentious view of the Jedi's actions. But instead, the only Jedi action we're left asking about is why did Soul try to lift an entire bridge instead of just lifting the much lighter children and bringing them over safely?
You underestimate my power! What have I done?
And we also have the scene in which May turns on Quaimia and tells him that she's going to hand herself in to the Jedi. Now Quaimia tells her that she'll be thrown in prison, to which May replies, "Not once I tell them what I know," referring to the Master. And you know what, May? I completely agree with you, because a couple of episodes earlier, the Jedi had recorded evidence that Quaimia facilitated in the murder of a Jedi Master, who was then let go with a warning for information about May. The Jedi are a galactic police force. You'd think the murder of one of their own would at least merit a trip to Coruscant for questioning, but instead, they are shown to be so incompetent, they would have been better off having Hitchcock and Scully run the investigation.
Not to brag, but Scully and I have a combined total of 14 arrests. Would have been 20, but we only got 14.
It's like the show was designed to make you ask the question, why? But not in an interesting mystery thriller way, but more of a, why did this show ever get made? Like, why did the prison ship have convicts who had the exact abilities needed to escape it, freely able to plot in their cells? Why did Osha so quickly succumb to Quaimia's dark side charms after he had murdered her friends right in front of her? And why did this little shit pull those wires?
Why did you do that? Funny.
And why did I watch this show again for this review? And then there's the dialogue. Now, I'm a lifelong prequel lover, so I probably shouldn't even be allowed an opinion on what bad dialogue is.
I don't like sand.
But this show makes George Lucas's writing read like a Hemingway. It's not just the fact that the dialogue is stale and contradicts itself at times, but how you can feel yourself cringe with certain interactions. The first meeting of Sol and Venestra felt like two strangers rather than two old friends discussing the loss of a fellow Jedi. The forced ship them interactions between Osha and Jeki stemming from the very first meeting. Mother Anastasia turning every conversation into an opportunity to spout some underlying social message. Now, credit where it's due, Manny Jacinto's delivery as the idiot sidekick and then badass Sith was great, until we get to the island, but more on that later. And I enjoyed the sibling dynamic between Yord and Jeki, and I think the show would have benefited from giving them more screen time together, but even with that, the show really struggled to tell its story. Now, as prequel lovers know, even the worst dialogue can be forgiven when it's delivered by the right character.
It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
But with the Acolyte, the character is as hard to connect to as the story. Now, I'm no actor, so I don't understand the intricacies that go into playing the role of twins, but I have watched Legend, so I know what it looks like when it's done well. I just wish Amandla had watched it also. It was a hard watch at points, as Amandla's emotional depth is the equivalent of The Rock trying to convince us these are 4 different characters. Every scene where a reaction was needed was just met with the same big eyes and stoic face regardless of the context. And I don't want to come across as hating on her, but as a performer, I cannot tell you one redeeming factor from her performance. Then there's Lee Chong-jae's Master Soul. The fact that this man learned English specifically for this role hurts me, because he is the most interesting character in the show, and I wish he wasn't associated with it. Though the writing of the character was odd at times, Master Soul was a standout in all scenes he was in, being able to actually bring an emotional maturity at the right times that is missing from the majority of the cast. And then there's Quaimia. Now, I know a lot of people liked him, so I might actually be in a minority here, but after his episode 5 performance, which I thought was fantastic, his scenes with Osha became so annoying. I get the approach the writers were going for with the gentle guiding of Osha to realising the power of the dark side for herself, sort of how Kylo wanted to guide Rey. But every interaction on the island was either Quaimia answering Osha's question with a question, or giving her some sort of philosophical message to ponder, all the whiles cranking up the sexual tension to a point that I was surprised they didn't just have Quaimia poke Osha with his meat saber, which of course Osha has already been given an eyeful of thanks to this scene, which left me pondering if these dark side seduction techniques were adopted by any future Sith.
Are you going to me?
I would certainly like to.
So were there any elements of the story that were enjoyable? Well, I did like the fight scenes. I thought they presented a unique view on the style of the Jedi at the time, with the primary focus being on defense and overcoming an opponent without the need of a lightsaber. And the crouching tiger hidden matrix approach was cool. And episode 5's combat scenes were great. I especially loved the brutality of the kills, which gave the show a brief sense of maturity which had been missing through the majority of it at that point. And the chase scene through Brendox Moon's rings was visually stunning and probably took up most of the budget, but I really like how they put it together, even if it did have that nonsensical ending. And I think they had a really good idea with the corruption of the Jedi during this time. It makes sense for the period, as we see in Yoda's comic how the Jedi stray further from the Order's purpose, which would ultimately lead to their downfall. And seeing this played out was interesting. And honestly, if Leslie Headland decided to create a series focusing solely on the Jedi corruption of the time, and then handed it to Tony Gilroy to rewrite, direct and release, I would pay good money to watch that. But overall, the story was an absurd mess, with no real direction, with constant flip-flopping, and with no clear idea of the motivation of the characters. And the worst thing is, I haven't even talked about this show's biggest crime.
I wanted to set it in the time period that we did 100 years before The Phantom Menace because, one, it won't step on any legacy characters, it won't step on any of the canon.
Are you sure about that?
Now, I'll be honest, I actually laughed at the fact that Ki-Adi-Mundi's cameo was of course in a scene where there is concern for the safety of a Wookiee.
We must learn who trained her. Master Holden, extract Kalnaka from his post on Kofar and intercept May.
What about the droid attack on the Wookiees?
But for the love of Force, Leslie, what the hell are you playing at? The beauty of the premise of The Acolyte was the fact that it was a show set 100 years before the established timeline, meaning, unlike other Star Wars projects, this show didn't have to work within the confines of canon. In fact, it was going to create its own, and Leslie had a blank canvas in which to make history within the Star Wars universe. Now granted, the High Republic books and comics were around at the time, but since this show is set at the tail end of the High Republic era, Leslie and her writing team had a lot more freedom than any creator of Star Wars shows to make a story without risk of impeding on the future events. And not only did Leslie impede on future events, she impeded on the future event. Everything, and I mean everything that transpires in Star Wars would have been completely different if not for this line.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
Had the Council taken Qui-Gon's concerns more seriously, he would have garnered extra support from the Jedi, overcoming Maul, which would lead to Qui-Gon being the one to train Anakin, which would put Anakin on a different path, and, you get the picture. The fact that it is Ki-Adi-Mundi that shuts down Qui-Gon's concerns when he is the one presented in this show as being in a room discussing the actions of a Force user using their abilities to murder Jedi is so needlessly careless and insulting to the fanbase that I generally believe this was done as an FU to George Lucas. Now, I've seen people try and defend this scene, saying, well, they don't use the word Sith and everyone dies, so Ki-Adi-Mundi never finds out, but come on people. This was a stupid and arrogant decision made by a writer who claims to love Star Wars and then went about creating the most divisive Star Wars content since the sequels, with gratuitous decisions such as that.
So, when series 2?
Oh, soon, I hope?
Awkward.
Leslie Headland stated in interviews that she had written the show with the intention of a season 2, and that really could not have been made more apparent. There's a lot that still needs to be resolved from season 1, such as what happened between Quimera and Venestra? What is Yoda doing during this era of Jedi corruption? Why is Plagueis bunking with Quimera? And why did that little shit pull those wires?
You son of a bitch! Why? Tell me why!
All these things that Leslie left with the seeming expectation of a season 2 are now likely to be left unanswered after Disney cancelled the show 1 month after the first season finished. Now, despite the cancellation and poor reviews, The Acolyte still maintains vocal support from sections of the Star Wars fanbase that had #RenewTheAcolyte trending throughout 2024. It was also Disney's second most watched original series of last year with 2.7 billion minutes watched, and a recent article states that analytical data tracking interest, engagement, and viewership across social media and streaming sites ranks the demand for The Acolyte being above the likes of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Ahsoka. So could this demand possibly influence Disney to renew The Acolyte? Well, it's hard to tell. Nothing further has been announced by Disney relating to The Acolyte at the time of recording, and given the high budget to create versus the backlash the show caused, it is hard to see where a season 2 comes from at this point. However, that doesn't mean The Acolyte is completely dead.
Hello.
There are novels and comics providing further insight into certain characters coming out this year, and perhaps if a season 2 is confirmed to be dead in the water, the mysteries of season 1 will be answered in future books. Now, I know I've been critical of the show throughout this video, and I maintain that the story itself was just as impactful on its demise as outside influences, but honestly, I would have welcomed a season 2. There's a lot of unanswered questions that I would have been interested in seeing played out. Besides, it couldn't get any worse. Could it?
It can.
So that's it. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen and space gophers, for watching. This is my first YouTube video, but there is a lot more content coming your way very soon. So if you did enjoy what you saw, please remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and get in those comments and let me know what your thoughts were on The Acolyte. And I'll see you guys in a galaxy not so far, far away.